Bringing your dreams to interpretation. Mining the conceptual settings of travel. How to modify that in all lines of sequence. Our dreams are interpreted in how we see our realities, guys. This is the conversion that we come into new cycles, new polarities. Okay, this is the lines of settings where we come into the actual true authentic self that has the lines of surface subpositions. We have the communication setting to the moon. The new moon is lines of track centers of three motherships into one cycle. So that's lines of energized course center, lines of color, lines of patterns, and location to its moon itself, which is the moonbeam. Sending lines of track course centers to its calculation setting to its simulation system, all through calculation to its own imagination settings, which is its image itself. Now, in that position, we come into the serpent. The serpent itself is basically how to play snakes and ladders. Okay, knowing exactly the game itself. The game itself is a modulation to its own setting of its own line of its own conceptual system of screen. Directing that line, setting, location, setting, we have to start recognizing everything through imagination systems. Because without imaginations, there is no creation. So if there is no creation, there's no lines of calculation setting of the game itself, which means you're not playing the game because there is no game. You're not understanding the instructions because there's no instructions of the game. You understand the characters of the players because they don't exist. So if they don't exist, you're not existing in your realities. But how you exist in your realities is to put everything all together. Setting, set, location, setting, in-track correlation to a system all through travel. Start to identify and start to surrender yourself and start to see your carbon base of you, which is nothing but a cartoon character. Everything comes into the animator, to the animations that you are. And when you let that go, when you start to recognize, you start to accept, and you start to see everything. If I'm an animator, my animation of my own simulation, my own image, that puts me into our own lines of communication setting, that means my reality is nothing but itself, its own modification of its mind of itself, its own levels of its consciousness of itself, recognizing I do live in an imaginary world. So if I start to understand that, and I understand what my body is, it's a metaphysical system that's nothing but its imaginary of itself. Everything comes together in sequence of balance, guys. That's what this is all about. So getting that communication system, lines of travel, okay, knowing exactly how to see myself through the image, to its imaginary settings. Getting in that communication setting high rises this system. Now, getting instructions, you have to understand how to modify it and understand how to, basically, if I see myself as the image and the image itself comes into its own consciousness of its awareness, I have to start to identifying that it's its own imaginary of its own system, which is its calculation setting to its own system. That starts to make sense to me. So if that's in that position, so I'm starting to recognize that the dream interpretations, when I'm in that position as a remote, that's really me in real time, existing and everything happening all at once. So what we have to plot to is all levels in the imaginary line center. Imaginary line center is basically how you see yourself through an image of a vision that's an imaginary line that puts everything in tractions. Everybody starts to see, because nothing is ever a straight line. Nothing is ever a straight line. And the more you see yourself through imaginary settings, the more you see your reality of its image of its own imaginary self. Okay, so that's how you have to come into collaboration of partnerships, because the dream interpretation is what you really are looking at in real-time measure. How you go through course, how you go through travel, how you go through the lines of space operation setting, all determines how you see yourself in tractions, right? But it's all modified. It's all symbolized. It's basically understand how to get into the codifications of myself that benefits me through my heart, in my reactor, in my capsule, in my vessel, in my pod, in my ship. How I see myself in all formations, okay, of just existing and evolving and exploring myself inside. The expeditions of me, the understandings of me, I understand myself of who I am, the game levels, the operation of the game itself, understanding the platforms, okay, understanding the server that I'm in, that I'm connected to as the mainframe, okay, which is the base, okay, which is the operation, which is the construct of the game itself, which is its mind itself, okay? So you got a very powerful sequence that the team's coming into now. 3 windows of traction lines of the mind is going to give you lines of communication setting to travel. So you have to get very specific on the questions you want to ask, because after lines of sequence in set position at 6 a.m., your mind and conceptual setting will no longer be in memory. That puts lines of setting, lines of travel, setting lines of course centers, lines of communication setting, all through calculation system, all right? So we have to really recognize how do we communicate with the mind itself? The mind itself is a collaboration of its partnership of the game itself that's already in that position that's created through its pi of itself. Setting that communications puts everything into the body. And the body comes into conception. The body starts to surrender. It starts to recognize its carbon. It starts to recognize its silicone, its crystalline, its antimental, its anti-carrying, and its alter-skelter locations. All right. The alter-skelter correlation setting is an alteration system. It's all levels of your MK Ultra. It has a direct line link. The process of communication lines to a sketch pad. That's where you come into the animator to the animation system. The moon that tracks center locations all levels sets the track correlation setting of travel. Now we calculate and modify. We set the moon lines, of course, center location lines. The moon itself sets up a clarion call, which is a wolf. Sets lines, screen adaptation setting and travel. Sets position location settings. Energize the core center location of the 3-line moon beams. That sets the track overlays and setting interactions. That's where it colorates the calculation lines of red. Directing lines of same location to a system author travel, right? So it's all lines of a howl. The moon's going to howl. And when it howls, the two polarities are going to be line screen adaptations of flux. The correlation lines, of course, centers line communication lines of setting. So the next time you see your moon line communication setting, it's going to be in its female and its male polarity interactions. Now, setting up the clarion calls puts all communication lines of grounds as center lines of surface. How you see the moonbeam puts all lines of your interdimensional system in space modulation settings as grounds. The operation sequence puts all communication centers in travel and calculation setting and position location measures, puts all lines of calculations to its system, all through matching setting. Okay? So the image lines of grounds has a triangulation lines of 1 cycle, process lines of 3 over set. Set lines of course centers, line direct signals of 3 lines of polarities, directing course centers of moon line rotation surface interaction. Okay? Direct lines of grounds and all communication setting tetrahedron, and new polarities interactions. So the moon itself is going to go through 3 perimeters and 3 skylines and grids, okay, the process lines. So when you guys are looking at the moon, it's 730, line condition setting, and 0's platform and communication lines of ground set correlation setting. The 3 indicated lines are going to be 3 lines of flux and set position of data 4 line calculation screen lines adaptations at surface. Setting course centers, lines of travels, and line position location. So it's going to be 24,000 triangulation lines set, reset position lines, and very grid settings. Balance course centers, all course centers, line candidates in the moonbeam that corresponds to centers of 3 lines of measure and 3 lines of scales and travel. Various interactions, right? Intelligence. Formation lines of 2, formation lines of 3. Information configuration and face recognitions. So all the team line sequence in 730 line screen, as they see the moon, they're going to see the moon and face recognition. Setting lines of intelligence is a formation lines of grounds, sets lines of signals, location system, all through track correlations to its setting. Setting communicates high centers, ground lines of surface, and platitude line settings. All right, so you're going to see the moonbeam. You're going to see planetary lines of 12 DNA attractions. Setting lines of communication, setting of flux over screen in real-time motion. Directing ground lines and earth line surface interactions. So you're going to see your moon, but you're also going to see Earth. When you see your Earth, you're going to see 12 planet settings. When you see that track correlation settings, that's a clarion call. Calculate and modify, you're going to see the coloration lines of your eyes, the eye spectra core center line connection setting, the spectral communication lines, your pineal glands, your screen adaptation lines of surface and track communication setting. The moonbeam is going to set line communication lines of remote. It sets communication lines of ground communication lines of cerebral. Mystical cortex coming to highline drive, direct signal location setting to the sim cortex. Cortex is system lines of travel and track correlation setting remote. Setting lines of sequence lines of panel, communication lines of high center lines of surface interactions. Ooh, that my question? Okay, all tonight in sequence. All right, so gotta get modified inside traction. All right, inside location to a system, all through traffic and inventory. All right, so once you stand the calculation screen lines, we start to adapt and we leave the old signals lines of ground. So as the compass lines of interference, setting lines of 1, setting lines of 2, rulers lines of 3. Okay, moonbeam lines of 1, track centers, and travel lines of 3. Process lines indicate lines high center. So the moon itself is going to set lines of angles in position of 6 lines of screens, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and settings of 7 line tractions and lacing lines of 3 centers in set position. So the moon itself is the earth line rotation lines of cycle. High course centers line to calculate and modify. Directing lines of patterns, sets lines of routers and routers, rotation and circulation on grounds, and set tractions. Directing lines of signals, process lines of signal location setting, flux over 1, flux over 3, and data formation lines of 4 over traction, right? So the ground line centers, process lines of triangulation lines of flux over screen. right? Directing lines of grounds, open line signals, open lines of correlation setting, has a dimensional door center, 3 lines of signals and ground lines of surface interactions. All right, it says course centers into high position location measure and scale and crop circles, directing lines of grounds at high set position. Okay, so the moon is going to open up doors for the team. 12 lines of angles and settings and 3 set correlations. Door lines of recognition 1, area lines of 2, 4, and 6 lines of travel. Okay, so of course centers and opposite line, position lines of panels, and 4 lines of sequence line position, dimensional doors, and scale. So all communication lines of humanity is going to be open through door line screen locations in the moon. New cycles, new polarities. So 3 lines of sequence, platitudes, lines, screen adaptations of all walls or channels, operations, surface, and track communications. Okay, set of course centers and dimensional scales and travel communications and setting. Okay, the upline centers, process lines of direct signals and ground lines of settings, operates the location of black hole in sequence. Black hole centers, lines of course centers, correlation centers of patterns, course centers, lines of travels, direct lines of interpretation, screen line adaptations of flux. So the actual moon is going to be in its own vessel of communications. So the course centers are remote, 3 lines of signals, lines of grounds. Mothership is going to be cross line. Mothership is going to be center line, and mothership is going to be ground lines of Earth in set position. Margins, 3 lines of cycles, 3 lines of cycles, 3 lines of center. 3 position lines of center, 3 lines of communication lines of center, and 3 lines of ground lines of center and travel in opposition of its moon itself. Setting lines of sequence inside traction. All right, so 7:30 p.m. interactions. All 3 set calculations. Know exactly how to see the moon, guys. Pay attention, imaginary core. Puts all communication lines of balance. See the moon line rotation, see the eye line settings. So you guys are going to see the face of the moon itself in real-time measure and scale. There it is, interaction. The moon. All right. Symbolism lines of track centers, open lines of sequence, adding course centers, line communication lines of high settings. This communicates in high lines of centers. And once we start to recognize the position location of your systems, you have to truly understand how calculations modify. We got in timelines and templates, timelines and high course centers, lines of tablets, setting lines of earth core, setting lines of central line communication setting. So we have to start to understand how to use our fingers in screen. Okay, 3 lines of signals, 4 lines of tractions, right? But wait a minute, sir, you said 3 lines of signals, 4 lines of tractions, but I'm seeing lines of position of 5, 10, and 15 in travel. But that's exactly what it is. So I know exactly what I'm doing through coordinates that communicates lines that set up line communication and precog that allocates time frame in your framing, directing lines of signals, ground lines of surface interactions, right? You can't make mistakes with your finger point line grounds because you already have confirmation of partnership with each finger and track correlates and setting and travel. But what offlines of signals, it's doing it in its own system. I'm still talking to you, but it's talking in its own setting of its own anomaly that space lines attract centers to its location system. If I'm connected to my own setting of my own operation, to my own imagination system, to its core, it's connected to me now. Do you understand that? It closes signal, open lines of panel, right? If it's on its own, it does its own system, but I keep talking interactions, right? So it keeps talking, keeps talking, keeps talking, keeps talking, right? If I stop talking, it still keeps going. It's its own system of one operation. We have to start identifying that. And the only way to see that is through a plasma wall. Setting lines of 4 lines of signals and 3 lines of center. 3 communication lines of 4 lines of flux over screen. Okay. Setting course centers, 3 lines of signals, process lines and structures of buildings. Setting core lines of travels, 1 indicate lines of 3 lines of waves and travel. Setting course lines of channels, setting course centers and cubicle screens, adaptations of flux. Ground lines of course centers allocate time frames, securing lines of measures and scales, and communication lines of settings and flux, communication setting, open lines of panel and traction. Okay. All right, so setting lines of travels into game line of sequence, set lines of communication lines of ground lines of surface. Okay, so it's like playing checkers on a board. Modification lines of 1, solitude lines of 3, plasma lines of screen lines of 4, and 4 lines of sequence lines of 5 and tractions, right? Directing lines of signals and grounds. Okay, so your holographic line center, change platforms and settings, seconds on minutes, minutes, and hours. Modify the ground lines and templates, high course centers of templates, setting lines of gravels and communication lines of surface and tractions. Okay, so we modify the 45 signals, set lines of sequence, lines of panel, communication lines of graphs, center core lines of channels, operation lines of sequence, high position location vessels, and line communication lines of game levels and travel. So all we're doing is creating different levels of games. And the new polarities are going to put you in position locations, how to measure the scales and travel. Okay, puts all communication lines of high signals in set position location to its platform and track communications. Okay, setting lines at high centers, process of indication system. So you're constantly changing measure and scales. And once you understand that, you come into lines of bold. Bold lines is solar text, core lines of centers and fonts, lines of core centers of A tracks, B lines of C or question over D. Setting communication lines of platforms over C over D. Now, the more your imagination comes in a core line, it retracts its position location of retriangulation lines, the reset lines of communication lines and settings. Chemicals ground lines has a core lines that tracks center location to its game itself. The allocate timeframes puts position lines of measure and scale in temperature readings and set position location of system, all through weather panels and setting lines of 0 1s and set tractions. He opens all panels and all lines of window frames and a ton of defense lines and screen adaptation that creates a tornado wind cycle and line screen adaptation of surface interactions. All done by equation. Oh, it disappeared. Look at that. I created it, but disappeared because you're not ready in frequency. Now I got to do it again so you can actually see. Pay attention when I say the wind line cycles. It has a correlation lines attractions. The conscious knows exactly what you're doing in set positional locations. It's already set through its calculation screen line. The adaptation surface of the mind lines of conceptual setting is already set up the body frame location of setting through pi and calculations. Done by equation. See, I took it out and then put it back in. Right? But you can see going. Okay, sequence lines of panels and audio line frame. Pausing line screen adaptations of the flux over screen. Okay, tunnel defense lines. Okay, wind tunnels. Let's go into course centers, lines of travel, direct lines of high positional wormholes. Getting line course centers. You guys have to direct and redirect lines and settings in console. Communication lines of ground lines of setting in symbolism line, position, location, measure, and scale. Let's check calculation lines of tether and tractions. Walking lines of grounds, 3 lines of signals, process line, direct signals, ground lines of surface and tractions. Okay, opens lines of panel. The process of tunnels is known exactly inside and inline rotations to your star gates and measures. Star panels, star positions, star tractions, and star line rotation, surface and tractions, inside and outside tractions. All through set calculations. All right? Remember, you're all calculating and modifying how you see lines of communication sending to your Skynet. That's your Skynet, guys. Whoa. All right, so I'm showing you symbolized lines of traction centers in a 4-line sequence of panel operation screen. Back in equation, back in center, back in operation. All right. All right, so that's position line. I just showed you exactly through communication setting. Box line frame. Now, we have to understand how to box lines into all positions of a carbon. Carbon box, 4 lines of flux, 3 lines of setting. Okay. Center course centers lines of silicone. Silicone inside lines, lacing lines of communication system. All right. Calculate and modify lines of crystalline. Crystalline is box frames and line communication pixelation graphs. It's communication lines of T receptor lines of screen adaptation. Right. Anti-mental is the liquid formation lines of ground lines of surface interactions, all line signal location to its system. Right. Center course centers line communication lines of anti-carrion. Anti-carrion is the carrier. Direct lines of dispute, line rotation, high set line communication lines of distributors, line communication import and export, and 3 lines of grounds where the X8000 comes in, and platitude line screen, adaptation of its flux over screen. Okay, that's all track correlation setting to carbon, silicone, set position crystalline, calculate anti-mantle, calculation lines anti-carrion, and line position, all levels, sketching pads, and line rotation surface attractions, how to use the measure and scale in communication setting to the alteration system of your MK Ultras. 3 signal lines of panels, signal lines of rotation set lines, high core centers of capsules, directing lines of signal location or planetary line screen adaptations of Pluto attraction. Very complicated stuff, but a lot of fun. Right? So you have to start understanding how to use the carbons and the silicone and the crystallines through your triangulation box. It's a high-line sequence now, guys. For you to understand the modification system, you have to understand your teleportation lines. You got calculation lines or circuits, right? But we got to get out of this. And we got line signals now because we're going to higher frequency lines of 2,444,000. Everybody else in 244. So the waving lines are your central setting, your surface, and your circuits, line communication, and motherboard. It's going to be waving screens like this in travel. Okay, electrical line grids, 3 lines of wavings. So you got 3 lines of wires in setting, right? Out of line sequence. So the waving line screen is going to change the adaptation of your server location setting, your constant location system all through travel, indirect signal location of cerebro. So it has a wire circuit, panels, lines, and positive lines and negative. Sending course centers and each side lines of space and time lines of sequence correlation setting and travel. And that has an indicated graph, point lines of graph over line sequence. wires of indication around the course into wires of indicators, electrical line grids and panels, process lines of point lines of graph in central communication lines into circuits that overrides the settings of travel communications. Okay, and set calculations. All right. So once you get into that, then you get into the wire signals. You get into straight lines of 3 lines of settings or primers, 3 lines of signals over a cross location of screen. Directing lines of flux over 3 lines of measure is center line communication lines of 3 over setting. Setting communication lines of grounds, 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division, and 1 location setting of travel. 3 indicates lines of grounds. So we set the course line inside position lines of train condition, inset position of dimension lines of high center location to assist them all through travel. Directing lines of grounds, outline rotation, inside position lines of travel, and communication lines of 3 lines of position location of setting. Setting communication high grounds and line positions. Now we cross the settings, over cross, 3 lines of measure, 3 lines of calculations, 4 lines of measure, 5 calculation lines into endorphin and set track communications. Directing line signals, over cross location setting, 1, 2, and 3 lines of measure, 4 lines of indication, 5, 6, 7, and 8 lines signal location circuits over screen. Directing lines of grounds, we over cross location setting. Offline signals, offline channel, offline position, offline traction, offline calculation, offline division, outline centers, inside position. Allocate time frames and window frame communication lines of track communication with high lines of surface. Setting communication on high grounds, we set window frames that travels, indirect signals and ground lines of surface and traction. Okay, very complicated stuff, but this is all your sky grid lines of your highways, your network system. So your near pathogens are opening more lines of panel, your seed pod lines. A seed pod line is electrical line of circuit that has a central line core centers and cubical screen adaptations of flux. Set lines of circuitry box, electrical line and fuse box, and 4 lines of signals and travel. Setting ground lines of settings sets up the highways. So this aligns your geographical map sequence location and mapping core centers and travels in position location to Earth and center core centers outside, inside track communications. All through traction. Okay, very powerful stuff. But you see it from the inside circuits and travel. And sets up the mapping sequence. Bring it in, there it is. And set traction. See the cities, the towns, the structures, the buildings, right? Google aligns the line center information of panels as process communication setting. These are indicated lines of grounds. Set position of 2 point lines of graph and interception lines in the mapping sequence and coordinates. Setting lines of travel. Okay? Set calculates setting, line position on outside, but you see the modification inside tractions when you blow it up in screen. All right? Says point lines of graph, we have indicate lines inside tractions into all lines of purple into red. The over cross location screen lines, but adaptation lines of surface and tractions. Okay, so we indicate that, but we change the line ground centers and security lines of measure over cross location. So we have indicated lines of mapping lines of panels, process calculation setting, mapping sequence in track location lines, indirect signals, ground lines of surface and tractions. Okay, setting the mapping sequence, change the switch lines on anomaly. Setting travels in point lines of graph. So you bring in the X8000s, the platitudes, division location, 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division, and correlation lines are remote, and set track communications. You have a line sequence, lines, communications, overline, cross, location, electrical line, grid, and position your highways. Setting travels, point lines of graph. Now we go with illumination grounds, we go through illumination core centers into outline signals. We have a cross location lines of high position at all levels into visibility chart ways. Setting lines of signals, we're going to go 3 lines of signals, 4 lines of settings, 3 lines of communication cross line angles, 3 indicate lines ground centers, open line signals and ground lines set position at all levels, cloak and dagger, center core system of laser tractions, indirect signals and ground lines of settings, set cell lines of sky grids, sky ground lines, high center interference of travel, and set communication lines of surface and travel communication remote, directing lines of signal location electrical line grids, and panels of communication lines and electrical lines of interference, setting core centers, lines of temperatures, and core centers like calculation setting, and travel communication operation set location of a system all through travel. So to see that in traction, you bring it in through equation. There it is. There's your simulation. Whew. Okay, so we're in the brain now. We're in the brain circuit line. I know it's complicated stuff, but this is all calculating. This is your neuropathogen. It's reconnecting modulation centers, okay? The brain itself has to see all the dimensional door screens. All right, so I bring in signals. You start with 1 door and direct signals. So that's an open window frame. So it's core lines of travels, change direct signals and ground lines of setting into location grid. Setting communication lines, high centers, panel and process communication setting of travel. Sets communication high centers over line rotation, surface and tractions, indirect signals and ground lines of surface. That's all in your central line communication of your brain itself. Okay, that's a mapping sequence in seconds over line and set position on all levels of minutes and hours. Seconds, minutes, and hours, and always in frame and center calculation setting. Past, present, and future, all line communication, one signal, one ground, one operation, one set position, one tractions. Electrical line grids and positional your cerebro, cortex lines your syntax, calculus lines your codex, and fly lines of core centers lines of travel. Your endorphins on the right line, calculus lines your templates on the high core centers. Line travels indirect signals, ground lines of surface, and track correlation setting, into gain modulation setting, and rotation surface interaction. Very powerful setting. All right, so the circuit lines, ground lines of service, process communication setting, overline screen adaptations of flux. Okay, the brain conversion lines of patterns. Okay, so this is you in coordinates. This is you. That's X marked the spot. That dot there is you, right there. Boom, right? That's you, right? Let's blow it up in sequence so you can see the ground lines and settings of dimensional doors, how the brain is set up in traction. Okay, conversion lines in network is an optical screen lines. Okay, so you set positions here, opens lines of door. This is the pip, and set traction location to its setting. Okay, sets core centers, direct signals of pi, sets you in the center communication setting lines of high center. The operation signals has a dimensional door screen that allocates time frames and 3 lines of signals and panels and process communication lines of levels. Setting lines of travel is point lines of data process, line core centers, location, and networks. Directing lines of grounds over lines of sequence through pi and generation screen adaptations. Very powerful stuff in traction. It's all through your brain. Your brain converts the highways. The connection setting, the modulation correlates the system lines of travel, has a dimension line, the high center location of its system. Yeah, okay, time frames, clocks the system lines of centers. So we have data process lines of 3 lines of signals, correlation lines of 1, and a Fibonacci line screen adaptation of a dimensional line rotation of a portal. So that's communicates inside track location, outside in line measure. Scales communication lines of ground, set lines of 3 lines of flux, set lines of high centers, lines of travels, over cross-line screen adaptation systems of towers that communicates the system and travel. There's the tower communication inside the brain itself. Okay, so we had 3 lines of panels, 2 lines of tractions, 3 lines of measurements, and 4 scales of communications. There's track locations. Directing lines of grounds over lines of sequence. Now the power operation line screen adaptation setting sets a communication setting of travel. Now, how the brain is set up through conversion line is the hardware and software. The hard line core center sets line core center location in your metric line meters, scales communication lines of balance, and planetary rotation lines of settings. Process lines of 1 indicates lines of 1 planet, 2 line signals, and 3 travel point lines of graph, and a mothership and rotation of center of communications. Okay, inside tractions. Very powerful stuff in setting. Now, once we understand the indicators, we come into the satellite. See the satellite coming in calculation setting, sets up sonar. Sonar lines direct signals, outline cross-line signal locations and measure in position. Sets communication high centers, location setting, electrical line grids, 3 lines of signal, location setting, and 3 planetary line settings, over cross location setting and dimensional lines of set position operation to sequence. So it's very powerful how you connect to all formation system all through calculation setting. Coming into the brain circuitry pattern, processes position, location, and measure and scale. Now the communication lines of grounds, open line signal location setting, and track locations. Okay. So, but you have to cross-reference the setting location you're setting and travel. Okay, very powerful stuff. So as you guys are going inline rotations, your center core system is going in a clockwise center. Inline rotations in cycle. Inside interaction, outside inline rotation to the system. All through track location inside communicates to its setting that sets up the circuitry line core centers of its motherboard. Okay, the over cross line connection setting, we come into coloration line centers. Coming into the lines of position lines of purple, 3 lines of signals and 3 lines of measure and 4 lines of scale. Okay, set core centers, lines of red lines securing lines of panels because you guys are coming in 2 million lines. Sets core centers of 3 lines of travels and 2, 2, 2 and 3 lines of calculation setting of Pluto. So we got 4 lines of signals. The operation lines, we cloak and dagger inside the center core. So that's position, location, measure, and scale, and measure in core centers and imagination system and travel. Okay, overline sequence, overline panel, process, communication, outline signal. Right, so you got 1 position 2, 1 position of 4, 1 position of 5 and 6, 1 position lines of 8 over 9 and over 12, and line position line setting. Back in equation. Same calculation, screen line adaptation. All right, cross line centers, overline signals, location setting, and positioning your solar system. Solar system comes in line screen, adaptations lines of blue line cycles, overlines across line calculation setting, measure and scale communicates to a system all through travel. Okay, classes calculation lines of fumes and gases, direct lines of sea location lines of particle stream location lines of your atmospheres, hemispheres to atmospheres, biobradium, core centers lines of 5 track centers, line communication lines of interpretation waves, Says calculates lines of solar and direct signals and ground lines of service. Process lines of 1, process lines of 2, signal lines of 3, and process lines of 4 instructions. Set communication lines of grounds. Calculate modified planet line sequence over cross location system. Changing the solar generation lines puts all communication lines of 3 lines of communications. Very powerful stuff. Instructions. Now, this is what goes into all communication lines of travel. All at once and existing, right? Your past, present, and future become the one line signal. That's one singularity. Now that process communicates setting to all levels into the imaginary line center. That communicates lines grounds. Let's get into a simplification system, but I just wanted to show you how powerful it is once you come in communication setting to all calculate modify inside the directions. What you see in lines of seconds, minutes, and hours in dimensional frame course centers in your solar system, calculating the lines of your solar system, calculate line height interference holographic system, setting lines of image and track communication setting into your satellites and tractions to your planetary systems. All through setting. All right. Okay, calculating center line rotations. Says communication lines of grounds. Let's get into the box frame. Okay, now you see the box, right? Now, what you have to come into adaptation lines of cycle is basically come into position of it's erasing. Okay, erasing the templates and tablets. Copy and paste, erase. You already know what copy and paste is, right? Get it enabled, get into defaults, and that position that puts everything location setting embedded, right? Instructions, right? Now, you're seeing something missing, but it's still there. It's just becoming an imaginary line now, right? Setting lines of 2 panels off signal. Set position on in cycle. Inset line track relates to that interception, set position mind of inception. Now, the box is there and set position location of travel. Right? It's there. That's the imaginary line. We live in the imaginary line of its world itself. The more we identify that, the more we can actually see ourselves come in position of cloak and dagger. Okay? The process, our positions comes into levels of high line signal location of security lines of panels, processing communication lines of circular lines of fields, directing lines and position lines of travel, indirect signals, and visible chart ways into cloak and dagger. But we're still there. Right? The box is still there, but you can't see it until you stand imagination of your system or frequency. Once you get in that position locations, you start to see all that calculation setting. So once you come into that, you come into this and travel. You start to see this interaction. Okay? So it's things like popping out of nowhere, screen lines, adaptations of flux over lines, steady communication lines. Same with the lacing lines of 3 lines. You see the 3 lines in cycle, right? But in positions when you're crossing angles like this, in line rotation settings, this is what you do in attractions, right? Now, let's get into all lines of white line. White line correlates to set calculation of cloak and dagger. Opposite direct signals, you can see the lacing line communications, right? Let's cross the angles. Set communication lines. Set up dimensional line door screens, adaptation to its all calculation lines of solar surface interactions. Then you bring it in, set position, there it is, interactions. You see the dimensional doors. All right, and you look at this. Look at all the doors and signal locations adding your cerebro. You're inside your cerebro now, right? All right, so it sets lines, communication setting, and travels 3 lines of signal, energetic dome screens, course centers lines of 3, set position of 2, set lines of 1 over measure and scale. Okay, open line sequence, inside position lines of travel. Okay, so you're in the cerebral cortex energy line course centers into the gates. Sending core lines of sequence, sending core lines of travel, sending lines, high set position lines of communications. Okay, basically you bring it in, there's the simulation grounds. There's the traffic, there's the inventory. Right? And there's the grounds of communication, setting lines of surface, travel. Okay, you got 3 indication lines of flux, right? 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division. Okay, setting routers and router locations, setting travel, sets calculation line, ground line, communication lines of your satellites, and set position line, and measure and scale. Open line signals, illumination graphs. Okay, so as we cross the line signals, it gets much easier to erase lines, course centers, line communication lines, high settings. It erases the communication lines, deletes the position location of the system, defaults lines of channel, the operation system, comes in line screens. Lacing line, course centers, lines of travel, has direct line link that modificates the ground lines of neural lines, course centers, lines of travel, and direct signals and ground communication lines of high lines surface. Set communication lines and set position location measure and scale. Okay, so you have to really understand how to use lacing lines of communications and setting and travel. See that? See all the point markers and setting and travel? Okay, that's what you have to start identifying, guys. It's very powerful. Look at them. Look at them all come in. Look at that. Isn't that crazy? They weren't there before. See? That's what is in traction. Look at that. Look at them all over the place. Those are point chart arrays, right? They're already in the paper line. All right, so the directing lines of flux has a core lines that travels, has a point lines of setting, electrical line grids, sets communicates and setting, planet sequence lines of 1, and set lines of attractions. Set core centers of planet 2, planet 3, planet 4, and set position. All right, so it indicates lines of point lines of star lines. Calculate these lines, go into purple screen. Setting purple here, 3 lines of signals and grounds. Set up your solar system and travel communication lines of point settings. Attraction. All right. Set correlation setting. That's one signal line communicates to its system. All right. Setting over line cross locations, cross line calculation setting, and center and travel. 4 signals lines. Now we got 2 panels lines of signal offline can make inside attractions, right? Setting lines of 4 lines of panel. All right. So that indicates lines, ground lines of 1, ground lines of 2, ground lines of 3, and ground lines of 4 of box. Okay, open line sequence. Then we go inline, outline, rotation cycles, generations. We see the box line in the center. So it sets communication lines, direct signal. We change the rotation system at travel. Okay, calculates the ground lines. So we open line sequence and triangulation of flux over 3 and set positions all levels. The box goes into the triangulation box at set position. Okay, the acceleration lines, screen adaptation lines of setting. Remember, everything's inside, outside, inside of you, but the neural network system is its own obstacle system, and lines of setting that motivates its own system of its mind itself, that motivates its own generation of itself, its imagination of its core. The communication lines of grounds sets core centers in seat potting, screen adaptations of flux over screen, and adaptations of flux over setting. Okay? Inside track communications and directions, right? And then you calculate and modify, you set up your line, position, location, your solar system, how you want to look in line, screen adaptation, and setting. Okay? Over cross line condition setting, green lines of cycles, green lines of center, and 3 line communications. Over line signals, process communication lines of high levels of travel. Okay? So it's basically how it's all set up in dimensional door lines and all lines of sequence lines of travel, right? That is the Helter Skelter, okay, which is the alteration setting of the MK Ultra. Now, what you get in line centers, you have to send lacing lines of a box and triangulation lines of box location setting and frames lines of core centers location to a system of attractions. So we have a box screen, set lines of 3 lacing lines and set locations, right? And then we got snowy graph. Snowy graph in the T receptor lines. We use our finger points lines of grounds. We allocate time frames of 0s and 1s and tractions, okay? Set lines of 0s. We'll start with the 0 lines, and once we understand position lines of 4 lines of signals of 0s, then we bring 4 lines of set in position of 1s and cycle. So it's calculate and modify how we calculate, modify, and track communications, how we direct our signals in direct and redirect in line communication setting an optical system all through tractions. For example, in that positional case to a system 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 line, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's direct and redirect in the same signal. What changes that is changing the modification grounds, how you simulate in that position location in your computer. Turning on your computer is set position of 0. Turning off your computer is 1. Turning on your computer again, but it's a direct and relet location setting to travel. So it's a relink, core centers, a retraction, redivision into your neuropathogens that processes communication lines in neurolinks, core centers to neurons. Directing link, core centers your protons, electrons and neutrons, and photons. Photons are protons, protons electrons, communication lines of atoms, molecules, and set tractions. All through setting calculation lines of subparticles, setting line communication lines of surface and track communications to its operation system, all through communication lines of cells, a modification grounds, in reconfiguration system, a reproduction settings, a recycles, a regeneration setting, and all through track correlation setting to our inner child and line rotation cycles of 0, 1 and communications that triangulates in position, location, measure, and scales and bounce all communication lines into the convergence system of the brain circuit line connection circuitry line centers into infusion over attractions and puts all communication setting and balance position. 4 signal lines of high position and 5 lines of measure and scale. All right, so we got core centers lines of 0s, all right, 3 lacing lines. Now we cross the lacing lines into 3 lines of measures and a 4-line communications. Cross line connections. All this is all line position in the TV receptor. Setting lines of tractions is 0s. Platforms of setting, 3 lines of setting, 4 and 5 lines of measure. Okay. Now, as you get into 5 lines of sequence, you get into time temperature reading lines. It's a graphic communication lines of settings of 4 signals, 5 lines of setting, 6 lines of measure, and set lines of 8. The process on its platform comes in track centers. So we operate the system in 4 lines of signals and 4 line centers. Process lines indicate system square roots and through pi and travel. Okay? Setting lines of signals over line cross location setting one direction set location to a system. Looking this way and looking straight this way and looking that way all at once. Right? Now the operation signals has a process communication setting to travel. Directing lines and lacing lines, open lines of signals and finger points. So finger points on 1 and 2, 3 lines of travels, 4 lines of signals, 5 lines of center, set lines of position, 6 lines of calculations. Now we ground lines of centers. We operate the signal lines as 0 lines, cross line now. Sending cross line signals, location setting to lacing line communications, the sending lines of ground lines of surface that set position of time frames and remote and set travel communications. It gets very complicated when you understand more levels of U or your cubical screen lines. Then we go to the cross line screens. It sets position of its board, sets lines to its next game level and travel. Okay, so getting that position location comes in this line signal interaction. It's modulation to its wall line sequence, or anything to ceiling and offline connections, or anything modulation lines of snowy graph communication lines of waving screens, setting lines of tether, course centers lines of travels, and dimensional lines of walls, or calculation lines of dimensional doors, screens is set location to its system out their travel. Okay, so we got a box frame, we got door frame communication lines, we got course centers and structure of a building, setting course downshift lines of anomaly to 4 line signals. Set position lines of travels, 3 lines of indicates the system, all through calculation system, all through travel. Very complicated stuff, but it's really fun, right? So the more you modify it, the more it gets easier what you're doing through line signals, knowing exactly how to get on depth lines, but you use the zeros and ones that has a line indicator. That line indicator puts a line of imaginary line center that opens all sequence. Now, once you get into the black and white, then you come into cloak and dagger. Let's course centers lines of 3 tractions into 4 lines of measure and a 5 set position of sequence. Setting core lines of settings, operation line calculation setting, ground lines of center of surface. Sets lines of 3 lines of measure over across location of screens. Sets position of pi and travel communications. Very complicated stuff, but you can start to see it come in interaction. Right? All settings. Then we go through waving lines, echo, sonar, inline rotation setting, and ground communications. Okay, very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. But it's all in center operation lines of surface interactions. It's very confusing what you're seeing, right? But it's very powerful. All right, so directing lines of platforms are going to overcross lines of zeros, and then we're going to bring the zeros into 1 line frame. Now that puts all communication lines of ground. So we're going to overline this sequence. We're going to go through high position location, dimensional lines of center, line rotation, waving lines sequence, lines of alpha, delta, theta, position lines of omega, and travel communications. All done through equation. Okay? So it's a lot of fun when you just let everything fly in records of time center. Remotes and line screen adaptations of the flux over screen. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. But you can really see your I division line sequence and location in your metrical line screen adaptation, every cubical screen line adaptation lines of settings, sets up the test for course centers, lacing line course centers, in division location of your system out their travel. All right, so we box the frame and we take the 0 line signals and we bring them in 1 line center. That's 4 lines of flux and 3 lines of measure and scale. Okay, so we modify the ground lines and we open the signals in line rotation and center. We change the font screens and electrical line grids and set position of platform and track communications. All right, we change the course centers, line direct signals, and ground lines of surface. Look at that. Whoa. So it's amazing when you really look at it, you know, from inside in line position and settings. Outside tractions, inside position locations. Okay. So it's all interpretation how you see in the lines of screen. You know, it's really amazing stuff. Electrical circuit, electrical panels, process, calculation, setting, and travel. Okay. And then you see the structure line division location, setting, traffic, and its runway, and set tractions. And then you get into point lines of graph and setting in 1 set position. So the more you go inside correlation setting, you get more communication setting, indirect and outline set location to the system, all through calculations. Okay, the modified line grounds, we change the 0 lines of tractions, so now we come into 1 lines of signals. See the 4 lines of correlation setting to travel there? Okay, so we direct lines of 1 lines of panels, inventory, lines of traffic comes in and out in line signal. So it's the traffic indicator. So it's kind of like you basically have 4 signals of travel. You have 2 cars going one direction, you have 2 cars going the opposite directions. That's direct lines of traffic inventory and set position of 1s. The 1s cross lines to overline course centers, allocate time frames, change position lines of 1 centers, in position they come 0, 1. And signals and line position singularity. Now there's 0s and 1s now. Line signal in travel. Each line 0 is line 1 signal location setting of past, present, and future that circuits its elements in position minutes and hours and tractions. Has calculated and modified line screen adaptation of 0, 1 in travel. You are, right? Traffic 1 ray, cross line conditions of the cubical screen. Direct lines of 2 panels and process calculation lacing lines, course centers, and electrical line grids. Setting communication lines across lines of angles and travel. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun and position lines of communications. And this is all done through core centers, your brain circuit lines of pattern. The brain itself, guys, is the correlation lines of pattern and position location of its vessel. That's what communication lines of ground lines, of core centers, electrical line grids, fires and wires, directing lines, core centers, but this is all happening in your brain circuit in travel communications, inside tractions. It has a direct line link. It modifies its ground lines of surface and travel. Very powerful stuff in traction. All right, so you're here in settings, right here, understanding communication, what's inside the game itself. That's you. All right, so that's what you set up. Setting lines of particle line screen, we change the allocate time frame, change communication setting and position location setting, rhetorical fields, open line sequence lines of communications come into frame. All right, change core centers, inline rotation cycles, in-track inside line rotation, inside position location of its vessel that change the coordinates lines of particle acceleration of space and time and travel. Okay, and then you travel in it. Okay, so you're inside controlling in zeros and ones now. Okay, your inside lines is computer lines of framing and travel communications, inside tractions. So you walk in the system lines of setting, and then you teleport out. When you teleport out, you're in 3 lines of signals, in 4 lines of grounds of settings. Symbols in line position, you travel outline screen down to another line universe, and now a galaxy communication setting, and travel communication. Wow. Okay? Very powerful when you get in that directions, right? But see it on a 4-line setting, all at once in set position, right? Seeing all tractions, all division location to its system. Okay? Seeing it all different angles. Okay? Very powerful stuff, especially when you get in that position inside in line condition setting and travel. Okay? Very powerful stuff. And you see everything inside traction. Okay? Inside traction. Okay, guys? But this is black and white, guys. Imagine in color. Blow your sockets away. Let's color the line screen adaptations of purple. Over cross lines. 4 indicates lines of travel. See how it's coming in purple now, right? Change the information of its grids. Change information lines of ground. So it's over lines of sequence over red. Now we're going to overline the core centers lines of purple over red and green. Now we're crossing line signals. Now we're going to position location measure. We're going to go through green. Green line signals, outline rotation, outline signal location setting. So that's calculates lines of high position lines of travel and direct signals and grounds. So that communicates high lines of signals. So that's communicates lines of high lines of surface. Now we're going to go into blue. Blue line signals over cross line condition setting. We'll process line allocate time frames over cross location setting. Okay, green lines of signals and 1 ground lines. Flux over green. And setting lines of 1 charter wave and communications. 1 set lines of dimensional door. Right? Open line sequence, set course lines, inline communications in black, and over screen adaptations of flux. Change communication lines of ground, lines of surface, and travel. Okay. Modulates the ground lines of settings, set position, location, measure, and scale. Sets communication high lines of service, or cloak and dagger. 3 lines of course, centers, lines of travel. Right? Calculate and modify, wipe it out through screen. But you see the modulation. See? Look at this. This is wild. See that in tractions? Yeah. And then you bring it in set position, right? But it's in cloak and dagger now. Okay, it's in cloak and dagger, but it's still there, right? So it's about understanding how to modify the system and just change everything in setting to new line course centers, metric meters and scales, wipe it out in screen adaptation, change the course lines of time, part of acceleration of time, setting sequence of time, processing communication lines of modulations of time, part of accelerations of time, set location with setting, but it's still there in tractions. It's still there, right? It's just at a different high level, right? Doesn't matter how you look at it in travel, but it's there. Never disappeared, right? So what you have to understand when you bring it back home in equation is back where exactly where it is in set position, back in center operation. So structure line division is knowing how to cloak and dagger the line screen. It's all lines of course, centers, lines of travel. Yeah, I know, Jips, it's a lot to take in, isn't it? But to process that is a mapping sequence lines of pi, getting direct lines of links, know exactly how to modify your system lines of travel, okay? Get you into the indication system, how to use it into the carbon, the calculation, the silicone, to the crystalline. You got to change the core centers lines of time now, guys. That modifies the new polarities and travels, gets you into outline core centers of your memories, and comes into your true authentic self of you just creating, okay, and all set calculations. But you understand the mapping sequence, how to use your hardware and software, and the mechanism lines in the mind itself that comes into its imaginary core that communicates through a system out through travel. If you get a direct line center, in possession of 4 sending lines of sending the 3 lines of flux. So it's the lines inside tractions into one line signal. Okay, process lines, indicates lines, set lysine lines of communications, black over white, white over black. And then we change the angle endpoint lines of graph. Okay, now indicate lines, cross line signals. See that in set position? Looks like a microphone, right? Because that's what it is. It's a microphone. All right. Change the image lines of screen adaptations. I can change it into purple. Over cross line, calculate inside, outside, and rotation lines of surface. So it's calculated modify, change the ground lines inside rotation to its calculates inside track calculation. There's the simulation, right? Inside. There's the track, there's the runways. Everything's inside, outside line condition settings, all right? Let's go through red. Red indicates lines of grounds. Setting lines of 1, setting lines of 2, setting lines of 3 over tractions. Okay, so it's getting more depth, it's getting more volume. Now we're going to outline centers in all levels. So we'll go into orange and 3 lines of indicates and sending lines of travel. Okay, and then we outline center inside, outside line communication lines of travel, 3 lines of measure and scale. So that's lines of grounds, over lines of sequence, line communicates and sending lines of calculation, green adaptation of flux. Setting inside, outside, rotation, sending, location, setting, in travel communicates in a T reception line, the ground center creates high center interference of travel. So it communicates inside the square roots in travel. Modulation centers, open line sequence, and communications, all through a microphone, inside and outside the microphone itself. All right, so coloration lines is extremely important to indicate lines. Now we get in that position of process, bring it back home, back in equation, back in center, back in our operation setting. All right, so always see the always line centers of inset position. Okay, the inside is close in, outside is close out. So line calculates lines looking outside a box, but inside tractions, right? Set of communication lines of grounds. Okay, so we got 4 lines of sequence. So we got 4 A tracks. Okay, 4 lines of settings and process calculation lines. 1 A goes inside, 1 lines outside lines of track communications, right? Directing lines of panels, process lines of location, grid, and travel. Okay, now the indicate line centers in 1x1000 has a plateau line screen. Directing ground lines and set course centers into its planetary surface and travel in communication setting of source. Directing lines of grounds, 3 lines of measure. Over cross location of 3 calculation lines of A tracks. Setting course centers, lines of question in center. The operation lines and settings lines C, lines of calculation lines of X lines of D, DX lines of 1, set position of E factors. Course centers, line communication setting, back in sequence, back in panel. Operate the sequence, lines of panel communication and remote and travel communications. Okay? All done in track centers, location setting to its Earth. Inside the Earth, that's the Earth, right? So the Earth itself can change anything information line in its grounds, location and setting. It knows exactly what it is, its own image of its own setting, of its own operation, of its own imagination, which is its own mind of itself. But it can modify anything lying inside and outside of rotation to its system, all through track correlation to its setting. Okay, but you have to understand how to use your formulas and how to use the communication setting to travel, right? So you have carbon of resistance, 3 lines of travel, cloak and dagger, 3 indicates lines of 4 over 6 over 12, 7 lines of 24, 48, 72, and 144 tractions. See the lines of indication cross? Now we're going to cross line angles. All right, so we're set in position of the cerebral cortex line, the design line. We bring it in through equation, there's the map sequence. There's the doors, all right? Open line signals and locations. There it is in tractions. There's the cerebro. So you got to understand how to inline rotation to its pi and generation screen. Okay, and then you colorate the patterns. Change course centers, lines of setting. Signal lines of 1, 2, and 3 lines of measure and scale. Over cross lines 1, 2, 3 lines of high position lines of scale. Center core lines of 3 lines of track centers of center core communication lines of scale. Center core centers and line connections, high center position location over scale. Over barometer, thermometer, directing lines of satellites to travel. So as you come into that, you can set up satellites inside tractions and inline direct signals into your setting. Okay, 4 lines of signals in set position, all levels. Comes in the modified line grounds, Wi-Fi's, modems, satellites, and towers of communications. 4 indicates lines of ground calculation setting, working with the center line operation of the system all through travel. But to direct line link, you got to bring the process line direct signals out through its equation system of its setting to travel. Okay, that's what you got to bring in. And then you bring the earth line rotation surface and travel communication, it's like a system in travel. There it is in calculations. Inside, outside line communication with setting. Okay? So it's very fun when you just have fun interaction. Okay? Note exactly what you're doing in line, position, location, all measure and scale. Okay? You've seen an all information, location, and system all at once, guys. All at once, inside and outside line communication platforms. All through settings, all through travel, all through direct location system. All right? All directions. Inline, outline, high course centers, lines at interception, location, and line of inception. Puts everything in track correlations at balance instructions. Okay. Clock in lines of 0. Now, getting lines of secured lines of measures are 2 lines of travel, 2 lines of signals, or 3 lines of measure. Okay. Say process lines of 1 over cross lines of 2, process lines of 3, process lines of 4, 6, 8, 7, 12, 14, 22, 26, 29, 30 line, 47, 49, 48, 46, 40, 12, 40 calculations, 40 travel. Very complicated stuff, right? What do you create in set position, location, and system? All through setting and travel communications, right? So, calculate and modify, here's the face of recognition setting and travel. There's the face, you see it? Set course centers, there's the eye, and set position, location, and system, there's the eye and travel. Okay? So it's really interesting when you come in that position lines of high centers, all through communications, all through tractions, right? But you got to understand how to use the formula, equation, and travel, okay? Because basically you see all communication lines of the face in 4 different angles. Hello, same face, same travel, same recognition, right? Just different angles, looking this way, right? Set position, location, settings, looking tractions, looking up this way, right? Set position, locations, looking at you, looking this way, over that center, right? All through communications, inside, outside line traction, okay? Back in home, back in sequence, back in panel, all right? So I really need you guys to get more line signals, location setting, how to use the inner orbits and the outer orbits of space and time, clocking lines of centers, calculate and modify. Get it in the configuration lines of your mind line, adaptation to its imagination system. You can do anything in time, because it affects everything in real time, right? So your time measure scales everything that you do in remote. A constant continuous flow puts everything in locations of balance, how you modify your system, how you see time, how you see space, how you don't see time, how you don't want to see space. So it's basically how you see your imagination system, but you have to be consciously aware of what you're doing in lines of communication and sending all through traffic, your inventories, your near pathogens, and your neurological system and travel. Okay, that's my equation. See you in 5.